Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your Farm Bill Update webinar. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions and comments following the presentation. If you would like to submit a question at any time during the webinar, you may use the chat box located on your lower right-hand side of the screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the send button. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press *0 on your telephone keypad to reach a live operator. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Sherry. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Sherry Steisel. I am the Senior Federal Affairs Counsel at the National Conference of State Legislatures and Director of Human Services Policy. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on the 2013 Farm Bill. This webinar is co-hosted by a whole group of NCSL committees and entities that are very interested in the Farm Bill: the NCSL Environment Committee, the Human Services and Welfare Committee, the Energy, Transportation, and Agriculture Committee, and NCSL's Hunger Partnership. Joining me today will be Tamara Spielvogel, who is the staff to the Environment Committee at NCSL. As a reminder, today's webinar is the first in a six-part series of e-learning webinars that the Energy, Transportation, and Agriculture Committee, the Communications, Interstate Commerce, and Financial Services Committee, Human Services and Welfare Committee, and the Hunger Partnership are co-sponsoring. Our second webinar, I'll just mention at the outset, it will be on June 21st, Friday, at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, focusing on alternative fuel vehicles. For any additional details on the webinar series, please visit www.ncsl.org. It is a very sunny day in Washington and beautiful weather out here, and it's actually quite a hopeful time for the Farm Bill. Today's webinar will feature three great presenters who will be providing an update on the 2013 Farm Bill legislation, and they're going to be discussing many of the titles and programs connected within as time allows, from SNAP to crop insurance to rural energy and agricultural research. And please do think of some questions. We are going to be having a very robust dialogue after the break, and I know some have sent in some questions already, and we'll be very pleased to ask them. Let me turn it over to Tamara to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Sherry. Our first speaker will be Rebecca Adcock, who serves as Senior Director with Crop Life's America's Government Affairs Division. She handles all government relations issues relating to water, domestic and international chemical laws, human health, air quality, and other issues. Most recently, she served as counsel on the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works for Ranking Member Senator Jim Inhofe. Additionally, before going to the Hill, Rebecca served as Government Relations Director at the American Farm Bureau Federation in Washington, D.C., and Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation in Louisville, where she managed a wide variety of state and federal environmental policy issues. As a reminder, we will hold a Q&A, as Sherry said, following all of the presentations. For those of you joining us via the web, please feel free to use the chat box to put in your questions as you think of them, and we will come back to them at the end of the presentations. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all right? Am I coming through okay there?
You're coming in just fine.
Great. All right. And are you going to do the slides for me there, Tamara?
I'm giving you the authority in a second as soon as I can find it.
Got it. Well, just as we're transitioning there, just a little opener of where the piece of the puzzle for my industry comes in. We really have a very small interest in the Farm Bill, but because I work for a group whose customers are basically the Farm Bill, we take Crop Life America take a sort of broad view of what happens within the Farm Bill process. So the good news from me is hopefully my plan is at least to tell you the what's in the Farm Bill, a little bit of perspective on what people who might have a different opinion about certain provisions might have to say about that, so that way you won't just get one opinion or the other, and maybe a little bit of perspective on where the rub and where the consensus is on the policies in both the House and Senate. I will also say that I am not an expert on any one title, so if you have a very detailed question on how a program might operate, I will do my best to answer it, but certainly would be happy to help follow up on extremely detailed questions, because I don't know anybody who's an expert on all parts of the Farm Bill. There's a tremendous amount of programs and topics that are covered. And with that, do I have the controls now? Yes, I see that I do. All right. So we're going to go into the next slide and go on over to Farm Bill realities. And this is really I think, one of the most important parts, particularly for those who are not in Washington, to understand what shapes, in particular this year, what shapes what a farm bill ultimately might look like if we are able to get one passed here in Washington. And I really started thinking about it, this is really about what are the realities that we're dealing with both in the farm community and in the nutrition and food aid community. And there's some practical realities in that we're dealing with a farm bill from 2008 that has expired, and that was in December of this past year extended. The policies and programs in general were extended, but there were many, because it was an extension, that were not taken up and not extended, and either are currently inactive, unfunded, or in limbo. If there were any ability inability at USDA to maintain them with found money somewhere. So we are operating under an extension of a 2008 general policy and program with a lot of gaps and a lot of things unfunded, and all of that runs out again in September 30th of this year. So the goal of both of the Ag Committee leaders and ranking members on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Hill, is to get a 5-year bill reauthorizing and reforming farm bill programs and nutrition programs to the President before that expiration of the extension. There is, for a whole host of reasons, the one thing that everyone seems to be in agreement on who care about this bill is that not having a farm bill / nutrition bill is much more problematic to the people who are directly affected than having one even that is less than ideal on their issues. Now, there's a little caveat there. There are some folks who are extremely fiscally minded who are skeptical of the need for both of these elements, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. And that comes into that political reality. The fiscal cliff, sequestration, the budget, appropriations. What are the potential real savings? What are the perceived savings? What are spending obligations? And how does that all fit into what is a growing and enormous deficit? The budget constraints on USDA are tremendous. It's an agency that has, across the board, taken a lot more cuts, and voluntarily and by command from the Office of the President, than just about any other agency out there. USDA has seen more cuts, and many of those were, streamlining and early retirements and some things like that. But it's certainly affected program capability, and it's one of the largest cost savings, considering the size of the agency and its mission, that's happened in the federal government, and that's before working through a farm bill. Public perceptions about entitlement reforms or aid programs, how people feel about social programs in general, the ideas of waste, fraud, and abuse. What are the political priorities and how are those perceived by the public, and government mandated obligations? How do people feel about mandates versus programs that are sort of the lift yourself up by your bootstraps kind of things? Those are building very much into this discussion, both on the nutrition side of things and on the farm and agricultural side of things. Polarized party politics, we definitely don't have to tell you that there are, the more extreme and purist ends of the political spectrum, both on the right and the left, or the liberal and conservative, or whatever, word descriptors you would like to use. And in some ways, on some topics, particularly when it comes to budgetary sorts of items, folks can come back around and almost meet because they come so far apart that almost those ends come back around and can team up in some ways to create some difficulties for this path forward for the Farm Bill, particularly in the House. Regional and product-related differences, and this is really more of on the farm side exclusively issue, and these differences have always existed. There are differences among the commodities and the agricultural products and critters that we grow here in the United States, and the perceived different needs and preferences amongst those producers and ranchers, as well as regionally, even within one commodity, how things are done differently, and a lot of it has to do with things that are as old as time, like weather and soil quality and growing patterns, and there's a lot of nuance, even not just amongst the commodities, but even within the commodities, about how people would prefer to see any sort of farm programs, be it conservation or otherwise. Legislative realities, and that is that we have a Senate Farm Bill and a House Farm Bill. The Senate Farm Bill S3934 just passed the Senate this week by a little bit higher margin than the Senate version passed last year. As you know, we didn't ultimately get anything out of the House. I assume you know that last year. But this year, the House is on track to try to mark up next week, probably Wednesday or Thursday, and maybe a very short markup of H.R. 1947, which is what they call their Farm with an Extra R Act. Budget impacts. I'm going to be covering in greater detail the commodities, conservation, and miscellaneous titles, and another presenter is going to get into nutrition, but I did put the number up here just to see the comparisons of an idea of if we get both of these bills through both of the chambers and we go into a conference to try to achieve a final legislation for passage in both houses and to the president, the places where we have room to negotiate. The House's purported spending has actually gone up from last year. The number between the House and the Senate as far as the cuts to spending were much closer last year. The House has found more savings for this year, and they kind of had to do that, their political reality. Senate is about the same at $23 billion. Cuts to commodities, probably within negotiable range. A few more cuts to commodities on the Senate and flip that on the House. Conservation, very much, the conservation titles, with the exception of one provision we'll chat about very quickly, should be pretty easy to reconcile. And the cuts to nutrition definitely are flipped in the reverse way, though much more dramatically between the House and the Senate. And again, that reflected the political reality for working through the Senate. And that is going to be the most likely sticking point when it comes to money in the bills. Commodity title, very briefly, these are the highlights or the more significant discussed issues. Both the Senate and the House bill eliminate all forms of direct and countercyclical payments. The Senate bill takes out target prices. They both take out acre and SURE programs. The Senate bill moves to an ag risk coverage, which is basically their version of a subsidized insurance program, and it allows for shallow loss recovery, and it also builds back in, which is something it was lacking in 2012, some accommodations very specifically for some cotton folks, and a little bit back on sugar, which was a problem for them last year. The southern folks who grow those commodities had some major heartburn with how the Senate structured things last year. I think I put the wrong slide in here. It creates new dairy programs. I did give you the wrong slide. It creates two new dairy programs, and does away with the previous dairy program that says there's a dairy production marketing protection program and a dairy market stabilization program, and those two are a little more favored by most of the production folks. A little less favored by the processing community, and the production market protection program would be based on the all milk price versus the national feed cost, because feed is a tremendous factor for the dairy folks. And then the market stabilization program is largely a somewhat of a voluntary target, at least in the Senate bill by design, that the market concerns and the stabilization there that is a problem or concern for the processors is dealt with in the Senate as more or less a voluntary, though strongly encouraged and somewhat tied to the previous market program that was just mentioned. Both the House and Senate bills contain disaster assistance, and I should go back, and I apologize, somehow I got the wrong slide in here, or wrong half of the slide. That reduces by 15 points the government share of premiums for AGI. That is not correct. What the Senate bill actually does, that was last year's version. What the Senate bill does this year is say if you have more than $750,000 adjusted gross income, you're not, as an entity, per entity, you may not qualify for Title I programs, period, and it puts a $50,000 cap on that as well. So I apologize for that wrong bullet. Moving over to the House side, similar to the same programs that they created last year, there is a target price trigger. There is the price loss coverage program and the revenue loss program. You have to have some deep multiple year declines. It is intended to be a complement to insurance, but it also is intended to maintain some of the programs that the folks in the South do like. And there's a similar insurance program that requires a 15% loss to be triggered for recovery there. It is a risk management system like the Senate program, but yet it does build in a broader price-triggered or deep loss-triggered program. The House version of the dairy price support is a little more welcomed by the processing industry and more skeptical, or the producing industry, particularly in certain parts of the country, are a bit more skeptical of the House version. It has margin protection for production history. It has a supply management that is triggered when the price goes below $6, and there is a total wholesale replacement. It does replace the price-supported income loss contract programs, but it is more market-based. It has a few more things built in there for the maintaining a certain market share at a certain price for the processors that, again, the producers are skeptical of how that will work for them. The conservation titles are fairly similar in that it's a consolidation of 23 existing programs into 13 programs. Fairly similar, some differences there at the margins that you can see by comparing the two. A little bit different maybe on some limits and caps as far as acreage goes, but for the most part reconcilable. And realize that throughout this bill, once you get out of Title I, some of these programs, or many of these programs that are established, a much smaller number of them have mandated funding, meaning that this authorization language requires that appropriators give them money. It allows appropriators to give them money. So some of the more established programs you would see mostly funded, at least at some level, like the CRP, EQIP, things like that. But some of the newer programs, or what we consider smaller programs, may have a very difficult time in the appropriation cycle, even if they are authorized. The biggest thing to note on the conservation title is the fact that the Senate links conservation compliance to Title I eligibility. The House does not. That is a very big sticking point, and it is not just a dividing line. What that says is that you have to be in compliance with all laws, rules, regulations, USD and otherwise, that relate to the conservation and the environment, that there are certain requirements, often management plans and things like that, and you have to be in full compliance with those things to avail yourself of any of the commodity title opportunities, be it crop insurance or some of the deep loss programs, or for that matter, dairy programs. That is one of those things that you might imagine conservation groups and some of the fiscal accountability groups really like, because if you're going to get the government's money, their thought is you have to be sure you're following the government's rules. The place where that falls down for some folks in the agricultural community are circumstances. For example, I can think of a circumstance in North Dakota and some of the Plains states where many of the conservation programs have had a very difficult. They have had extreme weather conditions, and they have basically found it impossible to meet some of those conditions, and have had and some of those conditions can arguably be very difficult and sort of one-size-fits-all in circumstances where they don't make any environmental or stewardship sense, but yet technically you're in violation of some conservation requirement, and you're either denied your crop insurance money during a disaster or a problem where you've lost your crop or had a low yield, or you have to give back what you've gotten because somebody has found a technical compliance issue. So it sounds like a no-brainer, but when you really apply it on the ground, there are some interesting stories to be heard about where this can be a problem and where it might be an absurd result. This is going to be an issue for the Senate and the House to have to resolve, definitely. And this is one of those places where the left and the right kind of meet back together. The trade title, a little bit of difference as far as who prioritizes what, who mandates money for what. International food aid programs are a little bit scaled back levels from the Senate from the House to the Senate. But other than that, it's a title that it's there. It's certainly important for the folks who have major stake in trade, but it's largely perceived as reconcilable. These are the other miscellaneous titles that we can talk about very briefly, and that is the credit title, which is very closely tied to Title I, the commodities. Fairly similar provisions there and authorizations there. Again, some better funded with mandated funding, some with not. Rural development is similar in that, but there are some differences, though I think they can be reconciled with some of the grant programs, particularly on the broadband. Research largely can be argued to suffer a bit under both, and the funding levels do have some differences between the two, but still probably largely reconcilable. Forestry, there again are some differences in fundings, the mandated fundings, the funding levels, recommended funding levels. Senate is a little bit more status quo. House makes some adjustments and accounts a little bit more for invasive species. And energy title, and that's a title that some of you may be interested in, and I'll be honest, it's the one I know the very least about, so I will be digging for those. The biomass energy has varying degrees of support in the House and the Senate, more so in the Senate, less so in the House, but it is a tremendously hotly debated and important, regardless of which way you look at it, view within agriculture. And the House cracks down a little bit more on sort of reining some of those programs in. Miscellaneous titles, there are some changes there that are at the margins if you care about country of origin labeling and GIPSA. And last, there is a pretty significant chunk of regulatory reform aimed at USDA and EPA and some work or some lack of continuity and workability between some of the laws relating to, say, pesticides and or CAFOs and other things, and reconciling EPA's interest and USDA's interest. The Senate does not address those sorts of things. Both the Senate and the House bill do maintain the National Organic Program, and I think that those are the big ticket items, and there are some different, marginal differences there, but the biggest difference here in the Title X, which I pulled out because of the regulatory reform aspects, those are the largest differences. And going to hold it there and let you all move on so that way we can take some more questions. And I hope I at least opened it up a little bit for the other two presenters.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was extremely informative. Now I'd like to take the moment to introduce our second speaker, Nathan Bowen, who is going to highlight some of the state-specific agricultural issues. Nathan is the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, or NASDA for short. NASDA represents the commissioners, secretaries, and directors of the State Departments of Agriculture in all 50 states and 4 U.S. territories. He is responsible for managing the association's activities related to environment, conservation, resource management, and pesticides policy. Nathan, with that, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tamara. It's wonderful to be with you all this afternoon. I remember about this time last year we were doing something very similar, talking about a farm bill, and as I tend to be, I'm more of a pessimist on these kinds of things. I'd rather be pleasantly surprised than disappointed. Last year, we really didn't see much of a chance for getting anything done, but I would have to say that over the past 3 or 4 days, my outlook for getting something through has changed quite a bit. It seems like this might be actually a chance for us to get something through. So it's certainly changed the landscape here a little bit. I might say, Rebecca, could you hand off the slides to me so I can take over from here? While we do that, I wanted just to real quickly say, NASDA represents the state ag commissioners, secretaries, and directors, and so we're coming at the Farm Bill from kind of a unique perspective. We have a nationwide perspective, so taking in all commodities from all regions, but we also have that state perspective as well. And so when we look at the Farm Bill, we're looking at it through a national lens, but also through a state lens. And when we started to go through the Farm Bill in the lead up to this Farm Bill, we wanted to really dig into some of the issues that were state issues, where state departments of ag and state governments had a particular interest. We also wanted to, we recognized that some of the issues, like when you got into things with the various commodities, would be ones that would be controversial amongst a national group like ours, and we couldn't have consensus on those. So we stayed away from some of those commodity-specific issues. But some of the issues that we did turn to, one of the ones that has been really popular at the state level and has been important to help to help the state departments of ag really assist their specialty crop industries, has been the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. And that's a kind of a sector of ag that traditionally hasn't had a lot of programming in the Farm Bill, but those grants run through the state departments of agriculture, and they allow the specialty crop industry to do things to improve their industry, but also focus on things that are important from a food safety standpoint and others. So we see that as a very relevant issue these days, and we've pushed hard on that block grant program. And while most of the programs in the Farm Bill this year, most of them are seeing decreases in funding, both the House and the Senate bills have increases for that program. The House actually increases it quite a bit more than the Senate does, up from $55 million a year to, in the Senate, $70, and then the House would increase it up to $85 million. So that's quite a big increase to that program. And also, one of the things that's interesting this time around is that the changes to the program will allow greater coordination between states, so there can be multi-state projects, which I think is an exciting opportunity. We've also paid a lot of attention to invasive species programs. That's an area where states have a lot of responsibility in keeping invasive species from taking over. There are a lot of efforts at the state level related to that. And some of the programming in the Farm Bill is very important to those efforts. The National Clean Plant Network and the what we call Section 10201, 10202 provides a lot of resources for states to help with their invasive species activities. That's been really important for us, and we've seen both bills. The funding for those programs is largely maintained. There have been some changes kind of make the programs run a little bit more efficiently. But we're excited. But both the House and Senate treated that program very well as well. One of the other issues that we have been dealing with a lot over the past few years are just regulatory pressures related to the environment. From water quality on down the list, we see a lot of challenges in that arena, and states are doing a lot of work, both within the departments of ag, but also, the departments, the environmental agencies at the state level have a lot of activities going on around those, and we see that the conservation programs in the Farm Bill are really important to providing voluntary incentive-based programs for farmers to participate in to help improve the environment and address conservation concerns. One of the things that we wanted to see this year was changes to the programs that made them more flexible, more locally driven, and more efficient. And while the pot of money is less this year than I think most folks would like, we do see a lot of improvement in the programs. There's a lot of consolidation to get rid of duplicative programs. There's some exciting new programs created. There's a regional conservation partnership program that consolidates some programs that are out there already and really helps to focus in on some of these regional and local environmental concerns. There's also some consolidation of easement programs that we've been working with a little bit, especially in some states, addressing some kind of specific nuts and bolts issues with those programs, and it's looking like that will be a positive step. We also have been looking really closely at the market access program, which states use a lot to help promote their industry, their ag producers overseas. This not only helps the farmers, but it also really helps urban, rural, suburban, small businesses that use American-grown agricultural commodities to make processed foods, so make cookies or so on and so forth, and sell overseas. The MAP program helps states in their efforts to connect local businesses in the states with foreign buyers. That program is always at risk, but this year the funding was maintained at $200 million a year. Rebecca mentioned briefly the dairy safety net and some of the changes there. That's an issue that our members have really spent a lot of time over the past several years focusing on. There's just some really tough challenges there, and the bill, I think, makes some positive changes to that safety net. And finally, investments in research funding, and then also, where necessary, administrative funding for the state, federal cooperative programs has also been issues that we've been tracking very closely and are fairly satisfied. There's some, with the specialty crop block grant program, the admin funding percentage went down just a little bit, but because of the increased funding that's available, most of the states that we've talked with said that would be something they could still manage since the overall money is going up. As we look at next week, and it looks like the House is going to take this up, we're expecting all kinds of amendments from touching every part of the bill, and there are a couple of the issues that we're going to be looking at closely. Obviously, there are going to be amendments on the dairy provisions and the crop insurance provisions, sugar, nutrition, all of the programs out there, but we're going to be looking very closely at the market access program. There were some amendments on the Senate side that were offered that will likely be offered on the House side that could cut funding for that program. And then another one that we're going to be looking at closely is in the House markup, Representative Steve King of Iowa introduced an amendment that would say that a state can't impose standards or conditions on the production of agricultural products from another state. And that was aimed, from his perspective, aimed at some states like California, for example, that have adopted restrictions on or standards for egg growing in their states, but have also extended those requirements to products coming in from out of state. And as you can imagine, that's a fairly controversial issue. Mr. King's amendment was adopted in the committee. There was some opposition to it, but we anticipate on the floor that there will be an amendment on that issue to strike the King amendment language or at least modify it. So we're going to be watching that one closely as well. Some states in some state programs have said that the King amendment might result in some unintended consequences on other programs. Others say that no, those unintended consequences won't pan out. So we're just keeping a close eye on that, a close pulse on it. But as I click through to the next one, as we get to the conference, assuming that the House passes the King Amendment, there's nothing in the Senate version about it. The House will probably keep that language. We really anticipate that that language in the end is removed during conference, but that's more of a kind of just us forecasting a little bit. Anything can happen once you get into conference. One of the other issues that we're going to be tracking very closely, and Rebecca mentioned this earlier, the House version has some regulatory-related bills or provisions. One of them is dealing with the court case back in 2009, National Cotton Council, that resulted in a situation where duplicative pesticide applications that are regulated under one federal law, FIFRA, and states are very involved in that regulation. State pesticide regulators enforce those pesticide regulations at the state level. But what's happened is that court case added an additional layer where those applications that are legal, are regulated under one statute, now have to comply with another set of regulations under the Clean Water Act, which has resulted in some duplicative permitting requirements, to put it briefly. The House version has a fix for that situation. The Senate didn't include it, but that's one of the other issues that we're going to be looking at closely in conference. Might just say that as we do look at the conference committee just a bit, assuming again that we get something through the House, like Rebecca mentioned, there are a lot of issues that they're really close together on, but that nutrition issue, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but some of the others that had been outstanding, like commodity issues. Last year, the House and the Senate were further apart than they are this year, so I think it's, I think we can see some movement there to getting some common ground, and there are some other issues that they'll have to work through, some of these on this slide, in fact. But assuming that we can get that nutrition number and get something that both chambers can live with, I think we'd be in good shape. But I'll save the rest for times or some question and answer time at the end, and we'll go ahead and hand this off.
Thanks, Nathan. We're going to turn to our final speaker, Ellen Vollinger, who is going to enlighten us on the nutrition title of the Farm Bill. And you've already heard it's certainly an area of great contention between the House and the Senate. Ellen currently serves as the legal director for the Food Research and Action Center, which is better known as FRAC, with responsibility for directing FRAC's advocacy on Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. Based in Washington, D.C., FRAC is the leading national nonprofit organization working to improve public policies and public-private partnerships to eradicate hunger and undernutrition in the United States. And as a reminder, following Ellen's presentation, we will hold a live Q&A session. For those of us joining via the web, please feel free to use the chat box in the lower right part of your screen to submit any questions ahead of time. And I will point out that if you are interested in NCSL's Hunger Project, our partnership project, Ellen is an advisor as part of our non-for-profit advisors for the NCSL Hunger Partnership, which can be reached at www.ncsl.org/hunger. With that, the floor is yours, Ellen.
Sherry, thanks so much, and thanks to you, Tamara, and all your colleagues at NCSL, and really all the member legislators from around the country who do so much to help struggling families and children and seniors, and thanks for the opportunity to join you for this particular matter. For people who wonder why SNAP matters and why the hunger community is very focused on it and on the nutrition title of the Farm Bill, I've just given you some reminders about statistics on how many people are struggling to feed themselves and their family, data that we have from Gallup, and food insecurity data from the federal government, but also a reminder that SNAP is helping to lift people above the poverty line. And finally, that actually the program, despite what people might think, is actually very much supported by the public, and 7 in 10 voters say cutting SNAP would be the wrong way to reduce spending. The Farm Bill, as you've heard, didn't move in 2012 to full enactment, and you've heard where we are now. The nutrition titles of both the Senate passed bill and the House Agriculture Committee bill would reauthorize but cut SNAP, and they're very sizable cuts. As just a reminder, my presentation is really going to focus on SNAP because it is the largest federal nutrition program, serves the most people, but also it's the largest component of Title IV, the nutrition title of the Farm Bill. There are provisions for the Emergency Food Assistance Program, TFAP, which is a lifeline for the emergency food providers around the country and food banks, CSFP, which is the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, a nearly wholly emergency food program for elderly people and will become even more so under the bills, and fresh fruits and vegetables also have funding in farm bills. But as you'll see, the 10-year cuts that are pending, $4.1 billion in the Senate-passed bill, $20 billion in the House-passed bill. And why do they matter to the hunger community? The most substantial cut and biggest change with respect to SNAP that's in the Senate bill is something that we refer to as a limitation on heat and eat. Increasingly, states have been streamlining program administration, trying to be smarter about how they reach people, do less red tape. And one of the things that they've done is to try to use information that they have from one program and use it in another. And with respect to SNAP and LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, those are both programs targeted to needy people. In SNAP, we know people are struggling not only with hunger, they're struggling with high energy bills. Many states have used the flexibility that's currently available under federal law to do that job of coordinating between those two programs, and in doing so, providing needy people struggling with those bills with more adequate SNAP allotments. The change that the Senate bill would make is to require a certain threshold of a state payment of LIHEAP before the state can do that kind of coordination. And it has real consequences, meal consequences. These are food consequences, because when CBO estimates that cut is $4.41 billion over 10 years, they're coming up with that figure by estimating that 500,000 households every month will lose about $90 a month in their SNAP benefits. That's a tremendous loss in food purchasing power, which, of course, is going to mean that there's either a cost shift to the states to try to fill that hunger gap, or a cost shift to the charities who are already struggling. It'll be felt more as a cost shift to families where they're already skipping some meals and cutting back on what kinds and amounts of food they provide if that were to go through. But that cut also has ramifications for states on their administrative costs and just their ability to run programs efficiently. Washington State last year estimated that because of the extra paperwork that was going to come with this loss of administrative flexibility, that they would need to add 14.5 full-time employees. That's their estimate. There are very on-point letters from many of your colleague legislators from around the country. I just picked out two, one from Assembly members in California. I could have picked the State Senate letters, but I just gave you the Assembly and the Massachusetts State Senate letters because I think they lay out why many state legislators share the concerns that FRAC does about what this cut would mean. There's an additional cut in the SNAP area that has gotten quite a bit of press attention, and so I just reference it for you. It's often referred to as the Vitter Amendment because it was Senator Vitter of Louisiana who offered it, and that would require a lifetime ban on SNAP for certain ex-felons, and that, as I mentioned, is very controversial. The House, which is going to begin debate, we think, next week. We know that amendments need to be filed by 2 o'clock Monday. The House Rules Committee probably will craft the rule on how many amendments and what kind of debate, possibly on Tuesday, and they probably will take up the bill Wednesday and maybe Thursday. All of that could slip, but that's at least the latest that people are saying. In the House, the cuts are much larger, the magnitude and the scope and what they cut. Like the Senate, there would be a change in heat and eat, but it would be a bigger change, and the threshold payment that a state would have to meet in order to get that administrative flexibility would be higher. That cut would amount to over $8 billion. In addition, though, the House bill would restrict states from using an option that they've had on the books since 1996 after welfare reform, to conform rules between the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF program, and SNAP, and lessen some of the factors that have to be taken into account and weighed when a family is applying for SNAP and when what benefit, if any, they're going to get is determined. We refer to that as categorical eligibility, and sometimes you'll hear people refer to it as CAD-L. It's been extremely important to states, we think, because over 40 have used CAD-L, broad-based CAD-L, to streamline or eliminate their asset tests and to have gross income tests that allow working families with high child care costs to have those costs taken into account for their SNAP eligibility. When gross income tests are left as low as they are in the regular federal program, many struggling families never have the expenses that they have in their budgets for other basics like child care ever taken into account in determining whether that money they have in their budget is available for food or not. This would eliminate the ability for states to operate CAD-L. In addition, the House bill would eliminate bonuses that have been put in place for a decade. In the 2002 Farm Bill, we at NCSL and American Public Human Services Association and others had tried to educate Congress about the importance of not only calculating what states get wrong, but also taking into account what states get right when they're operating the SNAP program. And since that time, there have been annual bonuses given out to states for effective administration of the program, for cutting down on errors, for having accurate payments, for not making inaccurate decisions, for reaching the people that are entitled to be reached, and for doing it timely. And those bonuses, we think, are well merited. We appreciate the job that so many state administrators, with help from their state legislatures, are doing in carrying out the program. But that would be eliminated entirely. There's also language in the House bill. I think it might depend a little how it's interpreted, but it would restrict some of how states are able to use the federal match money they get for SNAP education and outreach. And finally, it would lower to $25 the threshold for counting an error against a state when the feds are calculating whether a state has met payment accuracy or not. That's a very low dollar amount, particularly given the kind of inflation that's gone on. But that would be that's one of the features in the bill that I think probably matters to the hunger community, but probably also matters to states. CBO has also calculated the impact of the SNAP cuts from the House bill. You'll see here that because the heat and eat restrictions would be stiffer, that would hit 850,000 households. They would lose $90 each month in SNAP benefits. The CAD-L change, though, would eliminate entirely eligibility for 1.8 million people. And because children in those families are connected to school meals through SNAP, they would lose their regular access to free school meals. And CBO estimates that number of children who would have that access undermined for free school meals would be 210,000. The Obama administration has done estimates that are a little bit higher than CBO about that CAD-L impact, and we've given you a link to a chart that the White House prepared last year on what this type of CAT-L would mean from state to state. There are additional SNAP threats. We've heard there could be tens and more, probably 30, 40, 50. Nobody's given us an upper limit on the number of amendments that might be offered on the House floor. There were amendments offered in the Senate, in committee, and on the floor. Some came to vote, some didn't. Many of them dealt with the things that I put on this slide, which is ending the SNAP entitlement structure. We believe from FRAC that the entitlement structure is one of the things that allows the program to respond when need arises, whether that's because economic circumstances change or people have disasters. Some would do even more on the heat and eat front. There are proposals looking at whether to limit or end SNAP employment and training, limit or end SNAP nutrition education, change the definition of what foods are eligible for SNAP purchase, and some that might undermine legal immigrant access to SNAP further. There are lots of other issues in the nutrition title. I've just prepared one slide for you so that if there are things that you're particularly interested on those issues, you might want to take a look at the bills just to see. There are some very positive proposals to pilot mobile technologies and online transactions. There's support for healthy food financing initiative, which I know a lot of pioneering work was done out of the Pennsylvania state legislature. There's a provision for incentives for fruit and vegetable purchases and piloting that, and several others that I think are worth your knowing about. But I have to say, within the debate, it really is going to be about what are the big SNAP cuts, what's the number going to be. And HRES 90 is the vehicle for those who are championing SNAP and opposing SNAP cuts. And I've given you part of the text of that sense of the House resolution, as well as who the prime sponsors are. But the total number of sponsors is now up to 135. And so we've given you a link to who those sponsors are. Many of them are congresspeople from your area. And I, for some reason, don't seem to be able to move this. Let's see if I'm... For some reason, I'm not moving that next one. Let's see. Okay, Farm Bill timeline. You've already heard a bit about that from our other presenters. I will just say that from FRAC's perspective, we do see as a quite distinct possibility that no Farm Bill could emerge and that there might be another extension of current law. And from those champions of SNAP, I think that is not an unlikely scenario for them to be interested in. The last thing I've given you on the timeline, however, is one that doesn't not have to do directly with the Farm Bill, but it's a cut that is already in the pipeline. And November 1, 2013, your constituents who get SNAP will find that their allotment falls beginning that month, and it's because that is when Congress, in earlier legislation, decided they would end early the boost that had been given to SNAP benefits under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The outlook from nutrition, you've already heard that is probably a very big sticking point, and just to underscore that, I've given you House Chairman Frank Lucas's comment this week in which he said the nutrition food stamp thing is just the most difficult because of the wide disparity of the proposed cuts. This morning there was a press conference by a dozen members of the House opposing any SNAP cuts and urging a no vote on the bill, and many of those members, more than 24, are actually taking the SNAP challenge, trying to figure out what it's like to be able to eat on the average SNAP allotment, and there are some state legislators around the country and others who are joining them. It seems to me that in terms of resources that the last slide, if I can ever make this get to it, we would certainly start, as we hope you would, with the NCSL website. Sherry's already mentioned to you the hunger section, but it's such a wonderful resource. The NCSL does such a terrific job on a bipartisan basis, and of course we've linked to the two letters which NCSL has sent during this Farm Bill debate, and we've given you some links to things from the FRAC website that we hope would also give you more background if you need it. But again, thank you so much for letting us be part of this.
Oh, thanks so much, Ellen. And I believe now I'd like to open up things to the audience and see if we have questions for our presenters. And I know we've also gotten some in advance, but operator, if we could please begin the question and answers.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Questions will be taken in the order they were received. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide favorable sound quality. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove yourself from the queue by pressing 1. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question or comment, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Please hold while we poll for questions.
While the operator is waiting for your questions, and I think we may have also gotten some in the chat room, I'd like to just go back to Ellen's presentation for a moment. States share 50% of the administrative costs, give or take, depending on the state, a little less than 50% of administering the SNAP benefit, and the benefit itself is 100% federally funded. Can you, Ellen, talk a little bit about the issue of state flexibility and how it might relate to administrative costs in determining eligibility, why that would be important for categorical eligibility?
Yeah, we know that when states were surveyed by GAO back in 2006 for a report that got issued in 2007, that the SNAP administrators told GAO that categorical eligibility is the kind of thing that eliminates red tape and allows the caseworkers not to spend their time on things that are really redundant. Many SNAP recipients really are not going to be in a position where they have a lot of assets, but requiring them to come in and prove up with a lot of paperwork all the different kind of assets that and different kinds of accounts that they need to look and see, is there anything in there, and add it up and what does it amount to, and then follow that paper trail is a lot of time and effort. It's not necessarily going to end up in keeping somebody off the program, or will keep some, but it's time that's wasted in our view, and seems to be time that states view as wasted when those caseworkers could be moving on other things to do with the caseload. We have rarely heard from states that they have extra money that they are just waiting to devote, that they don't already know what they want to do with that money. We haven't heard that they've got a lot just sitting around, and it's I think because the SNAP administrators know it's difficult to come in and ask for more money, they tend to want to do the most that they can per caseworker and not have them wasting their time on tasks that aren't really essential to the job. So getting rid of that red tape, not asking a lot of questions that don't need to be asked, and tracking a lot of paper that doesn't need to be tracked really can streamline the process not only for the client but for the caseworker, and can keep those administrative costs down. I would also say they can also keep the state from being assessed if they make errors on unnecessary tasks. Those are errors that USDA may end up later fining the state for or sanctioning the state. So simplifying it, streamlining it really seems to make a lot of sense from the administrative point of view.
Thank you, Ellen. Operator, do we have any in the queue?
There appear to be no questions in the queue.
All right. I do have a question that we got sent in earlier, and I think this probably goes mostly to Rebecca or Nathan. Does the bill include any funding for disaster assistance in light of last year's drought and what appears to be a similar issue in this upcoming year?
I can answer that a little bit, Tamara, and maybe Rebecca has some other information too. There is some assistance. Both the House and the Senate bill authorize or re-up the livestock indemnity program and the livestock forage program that were created by the 2008 Farm Bill, but because of budget issues, sunsetted early. So those programs will come back. I will have to go back and look to see if it's a retroactive authorization for last year. I know there were some versions floating around earlier this year that would do that, and I don't know off the top of my head if these do. There are also some other provisions related to things like honeybees, trees, some of the non-insured crops that would be included as well.
Yeah, I think that is correct. Definitely disaster assistance is reauthorized for livestock, and that includes the breadth of livestock, which pollinators becoming a very timely issue. Honeybees have and continue to be covered there, farm-raised fish. as well as, I guess, the tree assistance for those in the commercial farming of trees. The goal, I know, on both sides of the Hill have been in this and future farm bills to definitely get away from the need for disaster assistance, to establish either a crop insurance program or a crop insurance program with the deep loss provisions or complement in the House to avoid the need for that. And again, I'm not clear, and I am looking back through the materials and referencing the legislation right now might be a little daunting and take a little too long, but I am not seeing anything here that necessarily applies those things retroactively. So, I
Rebecca,
think
I just went back and looked, and it does. The LIP and the LFP programs
have it in there.
Yeah, they're reauthorized or authorized for fiscal 2012 through 2018.
Yes, that is correct. Yes, that's what I have. That matches up. So, for crops, I think that the idea is no more disaster assistance, though that the idea is to get away from it. That does not, I don't think that there's language that precludes it, but it doesn't allow for it or plan for it or budget for it.
Thank you so much. I know we've still got one or two more questions coming in, but I do wonder, and this can go to any of the presenters, things seem very different than last year in terms of moving the bill forward. Do you feel there's more of a commitment to finish the legislation this year and get a full reauthorization done?
Yes. I think there are definitely, at least on the farm side of things, a sincere pressure from back home to get something done. I think that the leadership has acknowledged they were not expecting sort of the relevance of the rural part of the country to really matter to the extent that it did, and I think there's at least two congressional races, particularly congressional races on the House side, that are now believed in retrospect to have been largely shaped by the fact that a farm bill was not ultimately passed. And I think that there is a general desire, both on the House and Senate side now, seeing that from the farm perspective to get something done.
And I would largely agree with Rebecca on that. I think there's just in the past couple of weeks, there's been a shift a little bit, especially on the House side of getting something done. For no other reason, just so they don't have to talk about it for a while. I think with Boehner coming out saying that he would support the bill, which is really, that's something that I think is big in kind of showing the momentum that may be there, because he doesn't support farm bills. He's always been opposed, and so that's a big movement. Cantor, who's really, I think, probably been the biggest of leadership on the House side that's been opposed to it, has started to say some favorable-ish things. So I think the House has a much better chance of getting this through than I would have given it a week ago. I think it's still it's going to be a high lift, and we could wind up with a situation where we're looking at an extension again. But I think there's some momentum there, and I think it's going to come down to the President, Senator Reid, and Speaker Boehner getting in a room and figuring out a nutrition number. And I think if that can happen, I think the bill actually has a shot. We could certainly see this drag out some more, but I don't think that if they don't do it this year, they're going to be doing it again next year. That's an election year, and I think there's some real recognition that they need to do it.
I would just say from the nutrition point of view, they could have had the support of the nutrition community to move a bill in concert with other sectors, as was done in the 2002 cycle, as was done in the 2008 cycle, had people not on the Hill insisted on cuts to SNAP. And as long as that's the case, I think that it becomes much more difficult for that traditional pulling together to happen. I noticed that when a letter went to the Senate to move the bill, it went from a lot of groups, but no hunger nutrition groups. And that's very different from prior Farm Bill cycles.
Yeah, I think I definitely concur. On the farm end, great desire. If the bill doesn't happen, I think it's likely because it doesn't happen in conference because of very fundamental being in very different places from a nutrition perspective. I think that is the question for sure.
Well, thank you all, and hearing no more questions, we're going to conclude today's webinar on the 2013 Farm Bill. I'd like to once again thank Rebecca Adcock of Crop Life, Nathan Bowen of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, and Ellen Vollinger from FRAC for presenting today. For those that join late, or for those of you who'd like to listen to it again, we'll be posting a replay of today's webinar online early next week. As a reminder, our second webinar will be for the e-learning web series will be next Friday, June 21st, also at 3 p.m., focusing on alternative fueled vehicles. Additionally, for those of you on the line who have not done so already, I would highly encourage you to register for NCSL's Legislative Summit this summer, August 12th through the 15th. More information is available online. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great weekend. And one final note, all the materials, including the presentation and any additional materials, will be available online once we post the archive of the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.